Sorry, there it is. There it is. Good morning to you in the back now, too. Hi, we're so glad you're with us. My name's Tom, and realize many of you may be here. It's a baptism day. We're so excited about that. We're so excited that there's people that are going to tell the world today that they follow Jesus and that he's their Lord. And this is not what we normally do. We don't normally have a faux living room set up front. But we are in a series. We've called it Adventum. It's actually more than just a teaching series. It's a season of life here at Life Community where we're journeying together. We are adventuring together. And we're asking God to show us what might be ahead for us. And even in the midst of this, we have an opportunity after the service today with some people in our body who are taking this call to go and do something boldly in the name of Christ, and with Rick and Sheila, and just we're so thankful for what God's doing in our body. But where we are in the midst of this series, we've talked about having heart for what God's going to do. And we've discussed having a ready witness. What does it mean to be ready to share the hope that God has given us? And then we've moved on to where we are now, where we've talked about a ready community. What does it mean to be in a community that's ready for the movement of God? And we've discussed just what it means, why we are a church that is set up and designed to be the way we are, why we do cell groups. Small groups that are intentionally focused on the ministry of relationship and the word and mission in our community, why we do that. And what is it and what does love have to do with it is where we were last week. And today, we're going to do something different. And we're going to actually ask the question of what happens when you come to cell group. We want to be very practical. And so I've got some folks that are going to join me. And these are folks that are in my cell group, okay? So this is my cell group. So they're coming down, and they're, yeah, I see some hands, yeah. They are, many of them are being bold this morning to share in this. My wife, Christy, is here, okay, and she's with us. And Lee and Steve Zeidner, part of our group, yeah, and Michael and Stephanie Schroer. And by the way, this is Kristen and Camden McFarland, and they brought snacks, which is it's a part of weekly cell group. And Kristen is fantastic at it, so there may be people sneaking them as we go. That's the benefit of being up here this morning and not out there, right? And over here we have Kyle and Shannon Harmon, and the newest addition to our cell group, yeah, right, is Gracie, and she's up here because when they come to cell group, Gracie's with them, right? So the one thing we are missing is that we don't have a ton of kids in our group, but there's some kids, and they would, to make it realistic, we would have put them under the stage and had them banging around as if they were in the basement. But essentially, this is our group, and there's a few more people that couldn't be with us this morning, but in our group as well. But what we want to do is we want to share with you what it means to be in community in a practical way. And in the scriptures, particularly in the New Testament, and particularly in the writings of the Apostle Paul, but it's not limited to him, John as well, and in the gospel writers, we see all of these passages where they talk about what it's like or what it should be like when people are together and the phrase one another, these two words, one another, come up over and over again. It occurs, depending on which list you use, it occurs somewhere between 60 and 80 times in the New Testament where it says, this is something that you have for one another, do for one another. Far and away, the most references to this, it says love one another. Love one another. We talked about that last week. Agape one another. Sacrificially give yourself to one another. But this week what we're going to do is we're actually going to talk through some of the other one another's, okay? And I'm going to do very little talking, and my cell group is going to share with you what these one another's mean to us, okay, and how they're lived out in our group. And we're going to invite you to not only hear this, but think about what it would be like for you to practice these one another's, to live these one another's with other believers. And so I'm actually going to ask my wife, Christy, there's to start with this, because there's a section of one another's that talk all about what it means to like honor one another and to live in harmony with one another. And that's something that's key to having a cell group that's meaningful together. And Christy's going to just share some thoughts on that.
That's one of the things I've appreciated about this group of people, that I feel like when we started deciding to get together on a weekly basis, that we realized we weren't going to be good at this to start, but we were going to grow together. And I think that trust in each other and that willingness to forgive each other has made us brave enough to live in harmony and deal with any conflict or in an easy way and an honoring of each other way. So kind of coming where we are and not being content to put on a front or whatever, but continue to live in harmony.
And then we have the honor one another, and really what we've seen that mean is like putting value on others, what they have to say, and allowing them to speak into our lives, and then being willing to speak into others, pursue them. Yeah.
And as we put value on what each other has to say, we let them speak into our lives. We are able to then point out lies that we're believing and correct those and continue to grow from that.
Yeah, one of the things that you find with cell life is that there's almost like no, if we use the analogy of an automobile, there's almost no idling, right? Like there's almost no just sort of coasting in the river. When we start to look at, and some of the passages are going above our heads here, right? The one another's from the New Testament. When you see these things, there's no just sort of like, hey, if it's convenient, get together and hang out, have a good time, and then say goodbye and move on, right? The stuff that like it's almost like there's no idling through the low gears up to high speed. It's sort of like no, like there's a posture that we're supposed to have towards one another, and it honors one another. It forgives. That takes a posture of forgiving. Before I've even been hurt or offended, I'm ready to forgive, and that's a challenge. It's a challenge. And when we came together, people brought some like insecurities about that to the table. And it's one of the things I think that keeps people from jumping into groups, or some of the insecurities that they have. And I think Lee has just some thoughts about that.
I'm totally cool, calm, and collected. Not when we started, though. We started our group, like a year ago, a little over a year ago at this point. And for the first time, Steve and I went in as the older people. So what that looked like for me personally is I came and I looked across the couches and across the room and I was like, these people are so cool and I'm so old. And I was like, and so what would happen is I would just say like stupid stuff. Like I feel like it was like a month that Steve and I would come home after group and I was like, why did I say that? Like I was trying to be cool and like I just made a fool of myself. But I feel like everyone was so like kind about that and didn't make me feel like I was trying too hard. Eventually I let go of that and it's much nicer trying to just be myself now, but was not at the beginning.
And I would just add to that, like I thought you guys were pretty cool. Like, I mean, you guys have tattoos. And, like, we definitely don't, so. And I don't know, Shannon and I are pretty quiet people, so like even just doing something like this is hard for us. So just like stepping into a big group like that was challenging, I think, but we were accepted right away, and we appreciate that. So.
Yeah, I think one of my insecurities was thinking, there was one time in particular where we were, I think, going over a psalm and trying to interpret, like, what do you think the psalm is saying? And I was like, okay, I'll give it a shot, and I gave a complete wrong answer, and I was just like so embarrassed and thought, okay, I'm not going to open my mouth for a while now, and nobody else said anything. Everyone was so loving and like it was just in my head. But I've been in groups before where I feel like unless you're positive that you know the right answer, you shouldn't say anything. Not that that's a spoken thing, but I feel like in this group, it's a safe place to learn and just try and answer.
And we've talked about, how many of you guys remember that stupid thing she said? No, right? Like, and that's the thing about it, right? It's a place where when we come together, and we come together in a way that honors others more than ourselves. When we come in with a posture of, you don't have to be anything to fit in here. You don't have to be a type of person to belong. you already belong by the nature of what we're trying to pursue. Okay? That changes the dynamic. It changes the dynamic. Now, we don't do everything perfect, right? We'll share a bit more about that. But another area of the one another's in the New Testament that the scriptures spend a lot of time on things like serving one another, carrying one another's burdens. And so we've got just our group we've experienced it, and there's been times maybe where we've missed it, but we've got some folks that want to share about that, and Michael is going to share some thoughts.
Yeah, so when I think about this, I think about like just kind of practical ways that you can kind of help each other out. The number one go-to I always think of is like when someone's moving, that's just not a fun experience almost ever. And so kind of trying to help people out when they're moving, or, obviously Kyle and Shannon just had a baby, so it's like looking for ways, how can we kind of help them adjust to kind of that new part of life and whatever transition that's like, so.
Yeah, I know when Gracie was born 2 months ago, and Kyle and I were thinking about this idea of serving, we immediately thought about how much love and support we received from our cell group and people in the church. When Gracie was born, people threw us a shower, came to the hospital and visited us and prayed for us, brought us meals at the hospital and at home. And when Kyle went back to work, people would text me during the afternoon just to make sure we were doing okay, and bring me a coffee in the afternoon, or just to hang out. And that was just a real tangible way that people showed us the love of Christ, and we were just so thankful, because we had this fear that once we became parents, no one would want to hang out with us anymore. We thought like, oh man, now that we have a baby, people will probably be like, oh, they're busy, like we shouldn't ask them. But it was really the opposite. We had so many people just come around us, and that was just a real tangible example of Christ's love. And on the receiving end, sometimes it's hard to ask for help. You think like, oh, I have to learn to do it. Everyone else does it, so I have to do it all myself. And that was just a sweet reminder of community and how important it is just to allow people to love you and serve you when you're going through something. So.
Yeah, I think you have to kind of willingly open the door and tell people in your cell group what's going on in your life so that they know how to serve you, because it can be kind of hard to just shoot in the dark and go for that. But you guys were pretty open with, okay, yeah, being new parents, we're kind of scared about this, not sure what it's going to be like to have a new human in the house, and so.
Yeah, and little did Kyle and Shannon know that the presence of a new baby for parents whose kids are older now, like that's the opposite of wanting to stay away from them, right? We're like, no, it's one we get to hold and cuddle, and then they take it home, and we don't have to worry with the crying at night and all those things. So it had like kind of like the reverse effect, at least it did for us. And it's funny too, because another dynamic that emerged as we even discussed this process for us preparing to share some thoughts with you has been so good for our group to sit down and think through, like, where are we? Okay, where are we as a group? What's happening in our collective group? And it was interesting to hear Kyle and Shannon share how much they appreciated what was done, because, like, I think if we were all going to be honest, every one of us over the last few months would say, oh, I'm not doing enough for the Harmons, right? But this is the amazing thing, okay? The amazing thing that developed was that we were doing a little something even though we felt like it was insufficient, right? And the Zeidners were doing a little something even though they felt like it was insufficient. And the Schroers and the McFarlands, and everyone was doing a little something. And what happened was that the Harmons felt their needs were met, right? Their needs were met. It wasn't on any one person to do this. It wasn't on any one couple to make sure that Kyle and Shannon were taken care of. We took care of them together. It was a fascinating dynamic for us to discuss, because I'll be honest, like there were times in the last few months where I thought, like, I'm supposed to be like a leader in the group, and I'm just not doing enough for them. And the Spirit spoke into this time, and again, I was just stunned when they said, oh, no, we have felt so served and so cared for, okay? Because the beauty of one anothering, the beauty of the interconnectedness is that it's not just on me. and it's not just on Kristen. We are doing this together with them. We are loving them and serving them. And so we spend our time caring for one another, loving one another when we're in group. We meeting regularly together. When we're in group, there's certain things that we practice. There's certain one another's that are kind of directly things like teach one another. Okay? There's hard ones. There's things like admonish one another. We don't use the word admonish much, right? But it's sort of like when you see someone headed in the wrong direction that you get in their way and tell them. You don't just step aside and let them move in a harmful place, into a harmful place. And we spend our group time discussing those things. But there's one area in particular that we find difficult, okay? And my guess would be that many of you would find it difficult as well, okay? And that's in this area of sort of vulnerability and confession, okay? And so we're going to spend a few minutes here just talking about the idea of confessing our sins to one another. And Steve has some thoughts there.
Yeah, so as Tom mentioned, it's something that is hard to do. Like, when we read through the list of one another's, kind of just looking at like, hey, what does God say about this? Confess your sins to one another is in there once. And so it's one of those things where, as I was thinking about it, I was like, we don't like spend any time, like confession time. We don't start out the group like, hey, confess your sins, tell us all, the things that are on your mind, what you're in the midst of today. And and I don't think that's necessarily the way to go about it, but one of the things that's interesting is if you don't share or confess where you are in life, there's no forgiveness really, like from others in the group. We know we're forgiven by God, and our sins are against God, and they may not be against people in that group. But one of the things that I struggled with, and probably still in the midst of somewhat, but was just it's easy for me to start arguments online because I want to be right about things. And I felt like it was just one of those things that kept coming up in group. And I was like, man, like this is just one of those things that's like, it's something I really struggle with. And I felt like I kept talking about it week after week, and people were very loving and forgiving about it. And I felt like that was something to like work on and change, and it has been something. It's been a process to get there, but without like voicing it, without saying it to anybody, it doesn't. I don't know. You don't do anything with it. It's just sort of there in your mind, and so I think there's an important reason that we confess to each other. We did find that there's reasons that it's really hard to do. People have said things before in other groups. You have baggage of other people coming and saying, "Hey." Like getting all awkward about it if you say something that you're struggling with and they don't know what to say back. So there's things like that. There's there's just shame in what you're in the midst of. It's easier to talk about things that you've kind of come through than to talk about what you're in the midst of right at the moment. So it's something that our group is kind of working through and struggling through and trying to get better at. And I think Christy too has another example of this too.
Yes, I think the question was like, who's it hard to love right now? I think that's how it kind of led to confession, because we all have people who are anyways. And I had a week as a mom that mornings had been horrible, like getting out of the house. My temper and anyways, it was bad. And so it would have been simple for me to skip to something that was like a long time ago, but I just said, I have not been serving my family well in the mornings. I have not been getting up right. I've been blaming them for the chaos of the day when there are things about it that are selfish. And so I said that, and I was, it's been really cool, especially how Kristen and others have just reminded me, like, have you sacrificed this week? Have you been doing well? How have mornings been going? And I would not have had that support and that push if I had not been honest with what was going on in my world. So.
Yeah, and so there's this amazing dynamic, right? Where these one another's, you can pull them out as if they're individual threads, right? But when it comes down to it, like, if there's an atmosphere of humility and grace and forgiveness, then something that's really difficult, like confession, should be much easier. Now, of course, again, Steve mentioned there's baggage that we bring to this, right? There's past experience. There's times where we've failed, or maybe there's times where we would even say in our own minds, like, if someone said to me what I'm about to say to them, here's what would go through my head. Here's how I would perceive that. But if we never let ourselves show, if we never speak to our authentic motivations and desires, we never give people the opportunity to even practice the stuff that we discussed earlier, the forgiving one another, the not considering yourself better than another. Okay? If we never confess to the burden that we're carrying, we never allow anyone else to help carry that burden. And it's where all of these things, they come together and they mesh so that they create a dynamic. Okay? That's why it's not just sort of like a choose your own adventure or a pick and choose buffet line of these are the things that I want out of a group experience. I want all teaching, admonition. Well, no, wait a minute. Because those things are there and they're important, but the loving and the forgiving, the bearing with one another, those things are talked about, and they're talked about when it comes to if you just list them out, they're talked about much more. And I think they're talked about much more because they're harder. It's easier to sit back and to make an assessment of what others have said and to point at it or to pull it out. It's kind of a cheap gift to be able to be the guy who says, I know what your problem is. But it's a difficult thing, a much more difficult thing to enter into a relationship where I allow myself to be challenged by others, where I allow others to speak into my weaknesses. And so it's what cell group is there for, to practice these one another's, to practice these moments of koinonia, community. But it also creates an interesting thing, an interesting dynamic when it comes to just groups and where they are and where they go from that spot. And so Lee's going to just share a thought on this.
Yeah, so it's been an interesting journey over the past year. I feel like we spent a good couple of months just getting to know each other because we were all brand new and kind of meeting each other for the first time. And now it seems like we're especially talking about the one another's, learning like what that looks like, which ones we need to work on more, which ones we just haven't thought about, which ones we're doing okay with. And I think looking forward, I think we can get to this point where we're just used to hanging out. And so we just kind of stop, like, well, like I've got this stuff going on and, it's the same old stuff. And maybe we stop like sharpening each other like as much as we are now that we're like consciously working toward these things. I guess complacency maybe is the word, but I think one thing that I've had, and I think we've all had at the back of our mind with that, is that from the beginning when we started the group, and this threw me for a loop, Tom was like, sat us all down and he's like, you know what? If this group is operating in the same capacity 18 months from now, then we have failed. And I didn't know what to do with that. I was like, no. It's hard leaving groups. It's hard starting new groups, but it's worth it. And we're like building this thing together. But the more we thought about it and we all talked about it, like there's something kind of invigorating about asking like, who's next? Like who has God put in our path and on our hearts that like we want to do this with other people? Like I'm growing to love these people and sharing life with them, but it doesn't stop here. And so like Steve and I are already talking. We're already talking about just praying about it, being open to it. Like who is it that God's putting on our hearts to like experience this community with? We've got a handful of groups, but there are a lot of you out there and we'd love to get to know more people. And I'm sure that's the same with everyone here. So it's being aware that you don't get to a place of complacency, that you're always trying to sharpen each other through these one another's, but it's also keeping your eyes on the outside. Like who else can benefit from a community, an experienced community?
Yeah, it's very, like Satan doesn't play fair. We just agree on that. And so if Satan can't keep us from being together, I think that he's really good at convincing us that our time together is about us. Ultimately, it begins and ends with the people here. And again, I mentioned there's a few people who couldn't be up front with us this morning. It's just about that group. And he wants us to sort of like close our arms around it and lock our fingers and go like, nobody else, stay out, right? I've got my people. And it's very easy and very tempting to be selfish with this thing because, and you know why? This is great, okay? We're trying to convince you with our head, with your head, but we're also trying to convince you in your heart or in your gut. This is great. This is not, it's not work. It's work cleaning up the house, okay? But it's not work opening our doors at 7 o'clock on Wednesday nights and having these people in the house with us. It's like this thing that it invigorates us. It feeds all the other stuff that we do in life. It doesn't take, it gives. And it's easy to think about it that way and then to say like, well, if I've got it and it's good, I'm gonna hang on to it. I'm gonna try and control it and keep it for myself. I don't want it to change. But the truth is this, it's going to change. My complacency is going to change it. And so is theirs. My selfishness is going to change it. It's going to alter it. It will never continue to be the very thing that it is now. Okay? And so we step into it, and we want to express and say it, that the purpose of this thing is so that we are God's instruments, his vessels, to reach the world. Not so that we can have just a better life. Not just so that I can be invigorated. I'm not invigorated as some form of self-help. We're invigorated because we are God's missionaries to the world. And if we close our arms and say no one else is allowed in here, we ultimately wind up killing the very thing that's giving us life at the moment. Okay? And so we just want to, as a group even this morning, sort of challenge everyone. And challenge you with this thought. If you've never been a part of a cell group or a small group community, we think you should. And we're playing our cards. You should do this. Okay? You should do it because it is a place, and if it's not here at Life Community, if you're with us as a guest, and you should do this where you worship. You should be with people practicing the one another's. Because there are people who need you and what God has made you to be, who God has made you to be. And the world needs communities of people who are healthy, people who are growing nearer and nearer to Christ, so that the mission of the gospel, the mission of God's church can be fulfilled. And so if you've never tried it, we're going to beg you to try it. Try it here. We would love to have you try it here, so much so that with everything else going on today, okay, we're going to have an intro to cell groups today at Life Community Church. We'd ask you to come. They'll tell you where it is as we wrap up our service today. But if you would like to hear more or start to think like, okay, fine, stop preaching, I'm convinced, show up, and we'll help you find a place to plug in. If you're someone who's been around here and you've been in group and you kind of did the thing of like we've been there, right? Where I'm in and you know what? There's sort of a relief to not share all the time, to not be exposed all the time, and maybe you've sort of slipped out. I'm going to beg you to jump back in. You may be ready to lead a group. We've got some tools to help you. Would you begin praying about what it might look like for you to engage in a cell group here at Life Community? Would you do that? All right. We're done. Okay? We're going to sing a song, and then we're going to see some people experience baptism with some folks. Yeah, grab a cookie. These are awesome. So, not you. Grab a cookie, you guys. Okay? But we're going to sing. We're going to ask if Brett, you want to stay? Everybody stay.